After dedicating his life to sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, St. Peter was facing certain death. He tries to flee Rome according to Catholic tradition, but on the road leading out of Rome, Christ comes and appears to Peter. Now, Peter is stunned and asks Jesus, Quo Vadis, Domine, or where are you going, Lord? And Jesus replies, allegedly, I'm going back to Rome to die again, to be crucified again, because you're leaving my church, you're leaving my people. Now, Peter is overcome by this. He is convicted. He about faces and goes back into Rome. And with the time he has remaining, he shares the gospel, gaining many converts before finally being crucified by the Roman government for his religious crimes. And so it was that Henryk Sienkiewicz, and I apologize because I'm sure I'm butchering that name, got the title for his historical Roman epic, Quo Vadis, which we're going to dive into here. But before we do that, I think it's important that we take a moment to focus on the author himself. Now, Henry was born in Poland, and this is important, during the mid-1800s, when Poland, to my understanding, was partitioned among the Russian, Prussian, and I think also the Austrian empires. It didn't exist as an independent country. His family was of noble descent, but ironically, they were also dirt poor, and he did not do super well in school, but nevertheless had a decent education, going on to study ancient Greek and Latin literature, as well as Old Polish language. He worked as a tutor at times, he did journalistic work, he wrote travel essays while touring America, and started writing short fiction by 1867 at around 21 years old. In addition to Quo Vadis, he would go on to write several novels, 3 of which make up his most popular trilogy. Now in Poland, he's best known for that trilogy, but internationally, it's Quo Vadis, like hands down. So it's no surprise that people are often mistaken that he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1905 for Quo Vadis. He did not. He won the Nobel Prize for his entire body of work, just a general recognition of his massive contribution to the field of literature. But again, Quo Vadis is still what tends to stand out, especially in the West due to it being classics adjacent and because the book has strong Christian themes. In the late 1800s, that was still desirable, especially in America. But most readers in the West probably didn't know, I would think, why he wrote Quo Vadis. Now, for most of Henry's life, Poland was caught, like I said, in the crossfires of this political struggle with these empires. It was without autonomy, and its people really struggled to break free and establish their own identity. And for Henry, I think the struggle between the powerful, widespread Roman Empire and a tiny sect of Christian believers who were small but strong in spirit really struck a chord. And through Quo Vadis, it seems that Henry was hoping to give the Polish people hope, maybe to commiserate with them and their situation, but ultimately I think to stand firm on the hope that as the Christians endured the Roman Empire, so too would the Polish people endure the various empires controlling them. I don't know, that's just what I was able to see. That seems to be the general consensus amongst the research, but what I do know is that, or for certain, is that Quo Vadis was published in 1896 and very well received, both in Poland and eventually internationally, and it has since been translated into some 40 languages. And actually, by the early 1900s, I think, it was translated into 30 languages already. And I wasn't able to conclusively determine how the Poles reacted to Quo Vadis upon its publication, whether they caught and resonated with the metaphor for their own reality. But however they reacted to it back then, it seems to be, at least according to some Reddit users, still taught in some schools in Poland and studied through that now historical lens of Poland's political unrest. But if you're from Poland, I would love to hear what your experience with the book was, if any. But when it was published, its success was really due to the incredible, just absorbing epic nature of it. It was a love story, it was classical and so seen as virtuous. It painted the Christian faith in a really, really positive light, and I think specifically it did a lot for Catholicism. It brought to life many historical characters, and people just loved it. It sold 800,000 copies in a single year by 1905, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 1933, Time magazine published a report that Quo Vadis had been the most popular novel published in the US since 1895, which is, pretty insane if you think about it. But despite it being very well received in Poland and its sweeping success across the United States and beyond, I think there's a pretty good chance that most people have never heard of it before, at least in my generation. And if you have heard of it, it's probably the 1951 movie, which we'll hit on later too. Quo Vadis hasn't really remained in our collective consciousness the way that I think maybe Ben-Hur has. Like, I've heard of Ben-Hur, I've never seen it, I've never read it, but I've heard of it at least. I had never heard of Quo Vadis, even though it was also made into a Hollywood film, winning an Oscar. I think other historical epics, as far as film goes, other historical epics like Troy and Gladiator seem to have taken its place for my generation at least. And I think one of the reasons that it has somewhat fallen out of fashion is maybe how firmly planted it is in Catholic tradition and how positively it paints Christianity. Now, bear with me with this thought, but I do think that generally as a Western culture, we are less wont to read religiously themed fiction unless the work of fiction struggles with the faith, if that makes sense. Like, Quo Vadis is not an indictment on the Christian faith or the Catholic Church, and though some of its characters do struggle with the more like self-affecting aspects of the faith, the book consistently presents Christianity and Christians as virtuous and good and pure of heart, whereas I've noticed that more contemporary fiction that grapples with religion does just that. It grapples with it. It tends to show maybe the underbelly of it or the darker side of it. But another reason I think it's possible Quo Vadis has fallen out of fashion might also just be due to the translation. Henry was Polish, so obviously he wrote the book in Polish, and then it was translated, like I said, into English. Now, the first English translation was by an American named Jeremiah Curtin, and he translated Quo Vadis in a very traditional thee and thou style. And the effect on the modern reader, I think, is that it initially feels like you're reading something really stiff and emotionless, on top of likely losing some of that, natural flow from the author's, original language. Now, there's a Substack, Pens and Poison, which I will link below. The author of that Substack talks about how there are just certain phrases in the Russian language that cannot be properly translated into English, and she focuses on one specific phrase in the article. And I have to imagine it's the same for most all languages. Like, I wonder if the translator had freedom to make small changes to appeal to the native English American speaker, in the same way you might notice how books published in England just read differently even from their US published counterparts, whether in word changes, names, sentence structure, etc. I do wonder, was thee and thou a true translation from the Polish, or did he put that effect on Henry's work to make it seem more classical and uppity because this is what the culture wanted at the time, in the same way that we like to cast British actors to give movies a more foreign feel? I don't know. But it's also worth noting that there is a second translation that was done in the 90s that's meant to be more contemporary and readable for a modern audience, but it doesn't seem to be as, accessible. The older translation is the one I found the most. Either way, I think the way it's written does contribute to some of the reason why it has dropped in popularity. I do wish that people would push through the thee and thou, because I don't think that the book is stiff or emotionless. I mean, let's just take this one passage, for example. It's an exchange between two young would-be lovers. But thou knowest of Vespasian's son Titus. They say that he had scarcely ceased to be a youth when he so loved Berenice that grief almost drew the life out of him. So could I too love, O Ligia. Riches, glory, power are mere smoke, vanity. The rich man will find a richer than himself. The greater glory of another will eclipse a man who is famous. A strong man will be conquered by a stronger. But can Caesar himself, can any god even, experience greater delight or be happier than a simple mortal at the moment when at his breast there is breathing another dear breast, or when he kisses beloved lips? Hence, love makes us equal to the gods, O Ligia. And she listened with alarm, with astonishment, and at the same time as if she were listening to the sound of a Grecian flute or cithara. It seemed to her at moments that Vinicius was singing a kind of wonderful song, which was instilling itself into her ears, moving the blood in her and penetrating her heart with a faintness, a fear, and a kind of uncomprehended delight. It seemed to her also that he was telling something which was in her before, but of which she could not give account to herself. She felt that he was rousing in her something which had been sleeping hitherto, and that in that moment a hazy dream was changing into a form more and more definite, more pleasing, more beautiful. I don't know. I don't think that that's stiff. I think that's really beautiful, but I definitely do think that, again, within the dialogue, we do tend to feel some stiffness, and it definitely occurs more so in the dialogue, like in the immediate exchanges. So I want to read just the first bit of dialogue that occurs between two characters, Petronius and Vinicius, just to give you an idea of what that sounds like. Okay. "A greeting to Petronius," said the young man, entering the tepidarium with a springy step. "May all the gods grant thee success, but especially Asclepios and Cyprus, for under their double protection nothing evil can meet one." "I greet thee in Rome, and may thy rest be sweet after war," replied Petronius, extending his hand from between the folds of soft carbus stuff in which he was wrapped. "What's to be heard in Armenia? Or since thou wert in Asia, didst thou not stumble into Bithynia?" Yeah, so I'm not gonna lie, when I first read that, I was like, I don't know if I could do this. It was a little bit jaunting, and I will say the experience reading the book was definitely jarring for the first half, because I don't know, when I think of ancient Rome, I'm not thinking of that like thee and thou kind of thing. Like, to me, that's Shakespeare. Although now that I am saying that out loud, I mean, I guess it shouldn't be so jarring because Shakespeare did write Julius Caesar, so like I have read something set in ancient Rome that is written that way, but for whatever reason, it just threw me off. And I could not in my mind picture these ancient Romans. I kept picturing British people, or like Nathaniel Hawthorne's Puritan focused, societies, and like in Scarlet Letter and stuff like that. So that was a little bit hard for me. And maybe also the fact that I was also going into this book with probably some preconceived ideas about like what a novel set in ancient Rome should read like, because I've really only read one other book or series of books. And the reason that I even stumbled upon Quo Vadis is because of a book series I read when I was like 15 or 16 years old called Mark of the Lion by Francine Rivers. And, I don't generally like epics. I have no desire to read about war strategy or detailed historical timelines. But Francine Rivers, a romance novelist turned Christian novelist, wrote a historical epic post-conversion that was much more my speed. And because I think of her romance noveling past, it definitely had some beautiful romance throughout, but I was just enthralled with the immersion I felt into ancient Rome. Like, the love story was definitely important and at the forefront, but the cultural context around it was what kept me reading. Very similar, I would say, to my experience reading Quo Vadis. Like, the romance was great and it was there, but I really stayed for the setting. And honestly, I think Francine Rivers' writing in Mark of the Lion is somewhat comparable to even like Diana Gabaldon in Outlander. Just total sensory and cultural immersion and so much fun. I think I read those 3 Mark of the Lion books within a week or two, and I remember specifically I got them for Christmas one year. I didn't pick them up until our school had like a winter break around Valentine's Day, and I remember it was snowing. I was sitting in the living room by the window, and I just tore through those books, and I've probably read them like a few times through at this point. I don't know, I loved the setting, and I learned so much reading them. So with the memory of those books in mind, I wanted to find something similar that would immerse me like into Rome, hold my attention with a good story, and also show me a different part of the time, a different part or time in the Roman Empire. Because sometimes I just think like, I'd love to visit Rome in the 1st century, or I'd love to, see what India was like in the 1800s. So I Googled books similar to Mark of the Lion, and here we are. Had never heard of it before, no clue that it had been adapted into film, nothing. So let's travel to ancient Rome via a Victorian era Polish writer and get an idea of what this book is really about. Basic plot is this. Marcus Vinicius, a Roman elite and soldier, falls in love with Lygia, a Christian, and often aided by his uncle Petronius, spends the entire book trying to be with her in one way or another, but is continuously thwarted first by her faith and then by Rome itself. Now, the desire that Marcus has for Lygia sets the entire plot in motion and largely drives it to its end, with Nero's Rome and a character named Chilo coming along to create the drama and conflict that make up an epic and I'm sure enthralled the Victorian ladies. Lygia is described as a fair-haired, light-skinned woman from the region of Lygia, which, interestingly, is located in modern-day Poland. She's the daughter of a king taken hostage. She's described as beautiful and pure of heart, and along with her, at her side, like all the time, is Ursus, and he's basically like her highly devoted bodyguard. So Ursus is this big hulking guy. He's got a really soft heart, but throughout the book, he's known for his almost like supernatural strength, and that does come into play in the plot quite a few times. Now, after being taken hostage, Lygia is placed in a household, and that is the household of, and I'm going to butcher these names, but the household of Pomponia and Aulus. And she kind of lives there as their adopted daughter. Marcus, as a character, is a hot-blooded, hot-headed, get what you want, turd head, D-bag kind of guy at the start of the book. And really, he is so melodramatic about wanting Lygia. It's actually very, very annoying to read. But thankfully, he does experience some character growth. Petronius is another very prominent character, and he's actually a really interesting character and ended up being one of my favorites, as he appears like perfectly simple on the surface but shows more complexity as the book progresses. He is called the Arbiter Legalitarium, which, to the best of my understanding, if I'm even saying that right, he was like a peacekeeper in Caesar's court, and in the book he's very closely connected to the Emperor Nero. And speaking of Nero, he is actually a really big character in this book. I don't know much about the historical Nero, but I think it's safe to say that good old Henry played into pretty much every stereotype about Nero that at least I've ever heard, to the umpteenth degree, which made for an entertaining but hateful character essentially. Tigellinus is another one who is closely connected to Nero, though less influential to the plot. He is a historical individual as well, and he was the prefect to Nero, again, to my understanding, basically a very high-ranking official in Nero's ear. Now, along Marcus's attempts to obtain Lygia, he enlists the help of one of his slaves, a Greek self-proclaimed philosopher, Chilonides. I'd argue that Chilo drives a very large portion of the plot, and that he has one of the most intriguing character arcs. So if you're reading the book and Chilo comes on the scene and you find yourself thinking like, why am I reading about this guy? Why am I reading about his thoughts and his little conniving rodent ways? Just keep going, because it does become important to understanding what this book is actually about. And I think the author writes Chilo like really well. I know, I think for the modern reader, again, it might be a little bit difficult to really grasp the tone of Chilo's dialogue. It was for me at first, at least, just because of the translation issues, and Chilo talks a lot. So like his dialogue is just, you're like, where is this guy going? But I think if you can kind of endure through and get past that language barrier and get like a real feel for him, eventually you're going to see the significance of the character and like realize what's hidden in just like all of his he just talks so much. We also do have side characters, but they're important. We have Poppaea, Caesar's wife. And lastly, two characters I think worth mentioning are St. Peter and St. Paul. Now, those two characters, I'll be honest with you, I personally struggle when biblical characters are fictionalized in literature. They just read really weird to me. I don't know why. It's just like odd. It's not like a I think it's wrong kind of thing. It just reads odd to me. But we have Paul and we have Peter, and some of their dialogue is taken directly from scripture. Some of who they are in the book seems to be rooted more in Catholic tradition, i.e. Quo Vadis Domine is from Catholic tradition, not necessarily scripture. But it just kind of felt to me also, I think like the author just threw them in there, to be honest. They were a bit one-dimensional, very simple. Well, actually Paul was a little bit funny, but I find Paul kind of funny in the scriptures anyway. Quo Vadis, though written in third person, the story mostly remains in Marcus's point of view, and with Petronius and Chilo as runners-up for the most page time. And then just Rome in general, like there's a lot of detail about Rome, about its culture, its setting, and all that stuff. But we don't get much inner processing from Lygia, or from the perspective of Lygia, though instrumental to the story. She's just not very prominent on the pages of the book. And we don't really know what she's thinking too much or what she's doing, but she is still like a very, very much a driving force in the novel, and the story could not have happened without her, period. And bear with me with this thought, but I think that Lygia and her story in many ways is a microcosm of the broader collective of Christians persisting and triumphing over the Roman Empire in this book, which is a microcosmic hope for the Polish people to endure and persist and triumph over the empires, which kept them partitioned and suppressed in the 1800s. I hope that makes sense, but it seems to me like there's this funneling effect, which is why I think it kind of stinks that we don't get more from Ligia, because I think she could give us a more personal insight into like this bigger thing that's going on. Anyway, I don't want to give away too much of the plot and what happens with the characters, because even though this book is older, I still think that it's fun to meet old books with a fresh perspective. But the plot, to my understanding, follows the historical events as recorded by Tacitus. I think I'm saying that right. That took place before, during, and after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. It initially drags and then picks up speed in the second half while offering some fascinating insight about, what life in Rome could have been at that time, and just explorations of the human soul and faith. Now, before I mention the Mark of the Lion series and how I Googled books like the Mark of the Lion, but now having read Quo Vadis, I want to draw some parallels and highlight some differences, because I actually think that these books are kind of somewhat linked now. Now, as a side note, I just have really always been interested in the 1st century AD. And I think a lot of how we understand our world today is in part due to this trickling down from that time in history. I mean, regardless of what you believe or not, if you look into it like from a historical perspective, the rise of Christianity and how it spread throughout the Roman Empire and how those early Christians, formed and what they did, I mean, it informs so much of our culture today, at least the Western culture. I mean, that time in history gave us, essentially a huge chunk of the Bible with the Gospels, the letters of Paul, Timothy, Peter, etc., which is another thing I've been kind of exploring. And again, I don't care who you are or what you believe. Like, the Bible is a very influential literary text with massive impacts on humanity. And so this time in history, I think it's worth looking into regardless of what you believe. But end of side note. Quo Vadis takes place during the 60s AD, while Nero is in power, and just about ending with Nero's suicide, whereas Mark of the Lion is set just after the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD, at the beginning of Vespasian's reign. Actually, the Mark of the Lion book series opens with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the series goes until the Colosseum is built in 80 AD. And at the start of the book series, Jews are being scattered and Christians are being persecuted in the wake of Nero's supposed initial campaign against the Christians, which continued during the Year of the Four Emperors under, I'm going to say their names wrong, but Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian, where Mark the Lion picks up. Now, looking at these two books side by side, I do wonder if Francine Rivers read Quo Vadis. I am assuming she did, and trying to pick up where it left off, paid homage with her own similar story, because they are pretty similar. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just think it's interesting to know and speaks to the broader idea that nothing is new and that all things in art and culture have an origin and a long history behind them of inspiration and recreation, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. But anyway, the similarities. The driving love story in Quo Vadis is the beautiful hostage Ligia and a Christian and the Roman elite Marcus Vinicius. In Mark of the Lion, we have Hadassah, who is a Jewish girl who has been taken captive and sold as a slave from Jerusalem. She's also a Christian, and another Marcus, who is also some kind of Roman elite. Both stories are very much driven by one Roman's love, incidentally both named Marcus, for a young woman with a strong faith, which inevitably leads the Marcus characters and the characters around them to take a spiritual journey of their own. Now, both highlight the persecution of Christians. Both books paint the female lead to be almost perfect, the absolute ideal virtuous woman. Both lead us to learn about the games, inclusive of aforementioned persecution and the gladiators, and both work really hard to paint a living picture of Rome during their respective time periods, and I think in their own way, each succeeds. But where Mark of the Lion gives us insight into the female lead, spending a fair amount of the book exploring Hadassah's inner life, her own physical and spiritual struggles through slavery and eventually persecution, Quo Vadis, like I mentioned earlier, really leaves us in the dark about Lygia. And then this is a big one. Now, having read Quo Vadis, I believe that the Mark of the Lion romanticizes ancient Rome and martyrdom much more than Quo Vadis does. Quo Vadis is graphic, and in my opinion, it's way more descriptive of just like a disgusting treatment towards humans during, I guess, this time in history. It really vilifies the empire, and particularly Nero. But in Mark of the Lion, Rome isn't so much, while it's like this living picture, like it's not so much a character, it's more of a backdrop, and we don't get that demonization of it. Now, in both stories, the games are present, gladiators and fights to the death and stadiums and all that, but Quo Vadis reads so much more realistic to me. I remember reading Mark of the Lion thinking that like Hadassah's devotion was beautiful, that this was all fascinating, like at every turn she did the right thing, she was perfect in the face of struggle, and something about that made her experience less horrible and her eventual torture just like less impactful. But Quo Vadis made me confront the realities of how humans can treat other humans, because the majority of the tortures that the author describes is not for his main characters, but for minor characters and just the collective captured Christians. And there's something about that. Like, normally I would say the opposite. I would say that the more we know a character, the more I feel for them, and the less I know a character, the less impactful their hurt and struggles might be on me, the reader. But I felt some of Henry's descriptions of torture and dehumanization like in my soul. And I don't want to mix fiction and reality here too much, because I know this is a work of fiction, but the thing that stood out to me was like the way the populace reacts to the blood spilling in the games, like in the book, like just the sheer magnitude of it. And to use a more modern reference, it really read like Pan Am. But even just the idea that that behavior might be rooted in reality, I felt just like this gut-wrenching disgust and horror, and knowing that there are people in the world today who are definitively still persecuted is just, it's disgusting. And that's the word I kept coming back to, disgusting. But I appreciate the fact that Henry didn't sugarcoat it. Well, at least I don't think he sugarcoated it. It's very possible he did, because I have a pretty low tolerance, but I appreciate getting a more realistic perspective. And I said it before that Francine Rivers wrote a softer epic, which in hindsight was an easier read, but maybe not as impactful as it ought to have been. I mean, better to walk away from a novel being uncomfortable and confronting your own mortality and morality than to walk away in a dreamlike cloud of delusion, imagining yourself a martyr. Quo Vadis, I think, allowed for beauty and pain to intermingle, absolutely. I mean, I spent most of my time reading, though, with furrowed brow, because there was a fair amount of romanticizing of events, don't get me wrong, but a lot of things in the story just made me wonder about a lot of things that I don't think I wondered about in Mark of the Lion, which also could have been due to my age. You know, people will often romanticize the early Christian church and just ancient history in general, and it brings me to another question that I've been wrestling with, which is like, is Christianity the same faith that men and women and children gave their life for throughout history? And for that matter, is our modern idea of Christianity in America the same faith that men, women, and children, you know, give their life for around the world even today? And what I mean is, like, the faith does not change. Christianity is unique in that it cannot be changed. It's all or nothing. It's not a buffet. Read the scriptures closely, and that becomes apparent. The scriptures root it, and I believe God himself roots it, even though man may shift and change things to their own liking. You can't be half in and half out. Christ requires complete and full sacrifice, and the same rule that was back then applies for today, and that's Christ alone, period. But I think that we have diluted our understanding of the faith and maybe our experiences with it. If you go to church on a Sunday or at Christmas time, like, would you give your life for that? Like, would you be willing to be beheaded or tortured or taken captive for that faith? Like, most of us have never been confronted with that choice, but also just like think about this. Those Christian martyrs of the early church and throughout history not only gave their life, but their belief was built on the testimony of others. They didn't have a Bible to dive into or a local church to go and join in the same way we do now. They didn't have the resources we have to research into the history of Jehovah or the prophecies of the Messiah as one looking into Christianity might. Like, it was hard for me to wrap my head around that. These individuals were professing a faith in Christ based on the testimony of sometimes sometimes their neighbor, sometimes a stranger on the street, sometimes the letters of Paul, of John, of Peter, of those men who were going out and the women who were going out and spreading the news of Jesus Christ. And then it was like their eyes were open and they saw and they believed with every fiber of their being that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and stake their lives on it. And it was the Holy Spirit, Jesus, moving them, not their cool experience at church or whether they liked the music or whatever, not whether or not Christians were nice to them or not nice to them. And that's just mind-blowing to me. And it kind of makes me wonder about another idea I've explored in the past, is the dangers of knowledge, that sometimes I think we actually know too much. We have too much access. One of these days I would love to do a video on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, because I think that is one of the driving themes, and one of the driving ideas in the story is just that knowledge can be dangerous and that we can know too much, and that sometimes it's better for us to not think too deeply about things because our minds lack the ability to actually comprehend certain grand ideas. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for thinking and I am all for critical thinking. Please don't misunderstand me with that, but I think there's a big difference between thinking deeply and critically about something and overthinking about something. Like, maybe sometimes we overthink to our own detriment. Like, there is a certain beauty to having this faith. I think it's an interesting question to ask. Do we believe because we've been intellectually convinced? Or do we believe because we have actually, our spirits have been moved? That the Holy Spirit, according to Christian doctrine, that the Holy Spirit has entered and changed us. And I admired, and at times I would say even felt envy reading this book. And just oh, okay, you just believe. It's so, that's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. But it's also a work of fiction. And that's where we have to be careful when reading books like this. I don't want to walk away hating myself and demonizing myself or other people around me because they're not living this fictional world. But it does give good food for thought, I think. I think, like I said, it's good to wonder about these things. Anyway, those are just my kind of wandering thoughts. But, this book, I enjoyed it in the end. It took me the first half to get into, but then by the last half, I was reading well into 1, 2 a.m. in the morning. I was definitely fully absorbed. The language was not in any way, shape, or form, distracting me or being problematic. So I do recommend that you read this book. I think it would be super beneficial to look into some of the, more of the historical context of the time in which the book takes place. It was really interesting to read different arguments about the persecution about how the persecution of Christians began, how the fire in Rome started. There's a lot of really interesting discourse online about that. But also just the cultural context in which the book was written. I think, that's definitely something that I'm going to be looking more into. And, overall, I would probably give this book a 7 out of 10. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.